Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. Kate Chopin wrote this story in a single day, April the 19th, 1894. It's under 1,100 words, one of the shortest stories that gets taught in schools worldwide, and it's built almost entirely around a single hour in one woman's life. This is the story of an hour, and by the end of this video, you'll also know about a real, ongoing scholarly argument over a single word in the text, an argument that changes what the story actually means. Look at that opening sentence again. Heart trouble isn't just medical background. It's what writers call a Chekhov's gun, a detail introduced early, because it's going to matter later. Chopin tells you in the very first line that this woman's heart is fragile. Keep that in your back pocket because this story is going to test exactly how fragile. She did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once with sudden wild abandonment in her sister's arms. Chopin is doing something quietly important here. She's telling you Louise's grief is real and immediate, not delayed or performed. That matters because it rules out the easiest, laziest reading of what happens next. Whatever Louise feels in the next few minutes isn't because she didn't love her husband. Hold on to that. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. Aquiver is a lovely, slightly old-fashioned word for trembling or shaking with movement. But look at what Chopin's actually doing with this whole paragraph. She's surrounding a grieving woman with spring, birdsong, music, life bursting out everywhere. Louise is sitting in a closed room grieving, and the entire outside world through that window is doing the opposite. Growing, singing, living. That contrast is the whole story compressed into one paragraph of scenery. There was something coming to her and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? She did not know, it was too subtle and elusive to name. Elusive means difficult to grasp or pin down, and Chopin chooses her verbs carefully here too. This feeling isn't something Louise decides to have. It's creeping toward her, something she's waiting for, fearfully. She experiences her own emotion as an outside force arriving, not a thought she's choosing. That's psychologically exact. And it's also Chopin being careful because what this feeling turns out to be was not something an 1894 heroine was supposed to feel, let alone enjoy. When she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath. Free, free, free. And there it is, not relief, not shock, freedom. This is the moment the story stops being a grief story and becomes something far more dangerous to publish in 1894. There would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. Now here's where this episode does something the story itself doesn't advertise. That word her in the middle of that sentence has a real documented history of scholarly disagreement, and it's worth slowing down for, because it's rare that a single word carries this much weight. When this story first appeared in Vogue magazine in 1894, that sentence didn't have the word her in it at all. It read, "There would be no one to live for during those coming years." 1 year later, when it was reprinted in a magazine called St. Louis Life, the word her had been added, and nobody's entirely sure whether Chopin added it herself or whether her editor did. Here's why it matters so much. Without her, the sentence simply means Louise has been living for her husband, that he was the center of her life. With her added, the sentence means something sharper, that Brentley Mallard's will had been bending hers, that his wants had been overriding her own, that she was being lived for rather than allowed to live. One version is about grief and loss. The other is about a quiet decades-long erosion of who she was allowed to be. Most modern printed editions, including the version this episode uses, include the word her, because it's what later scholarship settled on as authoritative. But it's worth knowing you're one word away from reading an entirely different story. Josephine was kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. "Louise, open the door. I beg, open the door. You will make yourself ill." Imploring, and the sentence's importunities a moment later both describe the same thing, persistent, almost desperate pleading. Notice the physical staging too. Josephine is on her knees at a locked door, begging to get in, while Louise on the other side is having the most alive moment of her adult life. That door isn't just furniture. It's the entire story's argument made physical. Everyone else assumes she needs saving from her room when she's actually finally free inside it. She did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her. Monstrous joy is one of the most argued-over phrases in American short fiction, and I'm not going to pretend there's a single correct reading because scholars genuinely disagree. Some read Louise as a fully sympathetic woman, finally seeing her own oppression clearly for the first time. Others read her as self-centered, even a little monstrous herself, for feeling triumphant over her husband's supposed death. Chopin doesn't resolve it for you. She uses the word monstrous herself, and then has Louise dismiss the label as trivial almost immediately. That refusal to tell you how to feel about Louise is exactly why this story is still being debated more than a century later. Someone was opening the front door with a latchkey. It was Louise Mallard who entered. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of joy that kills. And there's the heart trouble from the very first line, paying off exactly as promised, except the doctors get the diagnosis backwards. It wasn't joy that killed her. It was the sudden, violent loss of the only hour of freedom she'd ever had. That's situational irony a third time now across this series, the actual outcome being the precise opposite of what everyone in the story believes happened. 3 words from this one: aquiver, elusive, importunities. Kate Chopin wrote this in a single afternoon in 1894. It was rejected by her own publisher for years afterward for being too radical, and it's now one of the most anthologized short stories in the English language. Next episode, we're leaving quiet domestic tragedy behind for something completely different. Kipling's Rikki-Tikki-Tavi, a mongoose, 2 cobras, and courage as a practical skill rather than a feeling. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and tell me in the comments, does the word her change how you read this story?